Chapter 8: Race and Ethnicity as Lived Experience. Defining race and ethnicity. Race is a socially defined category based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. Ethnicity is a socially defined category based on common language, religion, nationality, history, or another cultural factor. Humans, regardless of their race, are 99.9% genetically identical. However, race is still used to classify people, and sometimes race is a basis for differential treatment of individuals or groups of people. Sociologists, then, have come to understand race as a social category, based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. Race is more meaningful to us on a social level than it is on a biological level. The Amish, for instance, are a distinct ethnic group in American society, linked by a common heritage that includes language, religion, and history. The Amish people, with few exceptions, are also white. On the other hand, the Jewish people, contrary to what the Nazis and other white supremacists may believe, are an ethnic group, but not a race. Ethnicity and race are sometimes related, but they are not inextricably linked. Defining race and ethnicity. Sociologists see race and ethnicity as social constructions because race isn't based on biology. For instance, we don't test DNA to determine race. Racial categories change over time. Racial categories never have firm boundaries. Race isn't based on biology. Racial categories change over time. If you look at the U.S. Census, you will see that the categories of races change very frequently. In fact, 2000 was the first year that respondents were allowed to select one or more races in the racial category. Prior to 2000, respondents were forced to select only one race, even if they would describe themselves as bi- or multiracial. Racial categories never have firm boundaries. Instead, the boundaries defining racial categories are flexible. For example, there is no set regulation for determining racial identity. A person may have ancestry from mixed descent, yet may not identify with that descent. Or a person who was born in the United States, whose parents and grandparents were also born in the United States, might classify him or herself as Cuban because a great-grandparent was from Cuba. Defining race and ethnicity. The distinction between race and ethnicity is important because ethnicity can be displayed or hidden depending on individual preferences, while racial identities are always on display. Despite the fact that these immigrants weren't considered white upon their arrival, after a period of time many of these immigrants learned to speak like Americans and took on an outwardly American lifestyle. They were able to hide their ethnicity as a way to alleviate the tension caused by cultural classes and bigotry against them. Displaying ethnicity. Symbolic ethnicity is an ethnic identity that is only relevant on specific occasions and does not significantly impact everyday life. Situational ethnicity is an ethnic identity that can be either displayed or concealed depending on its usefulness in a given situation. You may have a friend whom you've met recently who surprised you because you had no idea that she was of Irish heritage until St. Patrick's Day, when she proudly displayed her ethnicity. This ethnicity may not impact her day-to-day life, but it becomes relevant in this occasion. This is an example of symbolic identity. Situational identity may not be relevant on a certain date, but rather based on a certain situation. For example, if you are of a certain ethnicity and you know that your employer is prejudiced against people of your ethnicity, you may choose to not disclose your identity in an effort to preserve your job. However, when you are applying for financial aid at college and you see that there is a scholarship available to someone with your ethnicity, you may choose to reveal your ethnic identity in this potentially beneficial situation. Displaying ethnicity. What is a minority? A minority group is a social group that is systematically denied access to power and resources available to the dominant groups of a society. It is not necessarily fewer in number than the dominant group. In South Africa, blacks dramatically outnumbered whites by a ratio of 7 to 1, yet before the 1994 election of President Nelson Mandela, Whites controlled the country, whereas blacks occupied the lowest status in that society. Minority does not mean numerically inferior. It refers to the group that has less access to resources or power. However, it is interesting to note that the unequal or unfair treatment of the minority group typically generates a strong sense of common identity and solidarity among group members. Racial and ethnic populations in the United States in 2013. White non-Hispanics were 197,836,231. Hispanic or Latino were 54,071,370. African American, 39,076,459. Asian, 16,093,994. Bi or multiracial, 6,189,840. American Indian or Alaskan Native, 2,329,643. Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander, 531,302. U.S. population by race in 2060. Racism, privilege, prejudice, and discrimination. Racism, a set of beliefs about the claimed superiority of one racial or ethnic group, used to justify inequality, often rooted in the assumption that differences between groups are genetic. Colorblind racism, an ideology that removes race as an explanation for any form of unequal treatment. Sometimes people argue that racism is no longer an issue in the United States. It is true that our race relations have changed, but many sociologists argue that racism has not been eliminated. In the past, it was socially acceptable in many places to display racist attitudes and to use racial slurs. That's not politically correct or acceptable anymore, so people tend to reserve their attitudes until they know they are in like-minded company. However, this in no way means that racism has been eliminated. It's just more difficult, sometimes to identify, which, many argue, is actually worse. Sociologist Edward Bonilla Silva argues that colorblindness makes these subtle forms of racism difficult to acknowledge and address productively. Prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is a thought process, an idea about the characteristics of a group, applied to all members of that group, unlikely to change regardless of the evidence against it. Discrimination, an action, unequal treatment of individuals because of their social group, usually motivated by prejudice. It is important to distinguish between prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is an internal evaluation, and discrimination is an action. While it makes sense to see these things as happening chronologically or in order, it is important to know that that's not always the case. Some people may be prejudiced, yet not discriminate against individuals. Others may discriminate, yet not be prejudiced. For instance, a manager may refuse to hire Chinese people because other people in the office don't like them, even though the manager himself doesn't actually dislike Chinese people at all. Prejudice and discrimination. Individual discrimination is discrimination carried out by one person against another. Institutional discrimination is systematic discrimination carried out by social institutions, political, economic, educational, and others, that affect all members of a group who come into contact with it. While any kind of discrimination is problematic, institutional discrimination is bigger than individual discrimination and more difficult to address. Individual discrimination is a type of discrimination by one individual against another. Institutional discrimination refers to a structural disadvantage for an entire group of individuals based on their group membership. Institutional discrimination is often more difficult to observe because it is not just one person acting against another. It might instead be embedded in policies, rules, traditions, or beliefs, and usually no one person can be held accountable. Therefore, eliminating institutional discrimination is a significantly more challenging task than eliminating individual discrimination. Theoretical approaches to understanding race. Functionalist theories focus on the ways that race creates social ties and strengthens group bonds, acknowledges that such ties can lead to violence and social conflict between groups. Functionalist theories state that racial and ethnic differences are a necessary part of society. Even racial inequality has functions that help maintain social order. Theoretical approaches to understanding race. Conflict theory focuses on the struggle for power and control over scarce resources. Early conflict theorists tried to explain race as a result of economic oppression. The theory states that racial and ethnic differences create intergroup conflict. Minority and majority groups have different interests and may find themselves at odds as they attempt to secure and protect them. Theoretical approaches to understanding race. Symbolic interactionist focus on the ways that race, class, and gender intersect to produce an individual's identity. See race as an aspect of identity established through interaction. There are several different ways that we project and receive our racial and ethnic identities. This theory states that race and ethnicity are part of our presentation of self. Social construction of race. Racial passing, or living as if one is a member of a different racial category, has a long history in the United States. Double consciousness. W.E.B. Du Bois' term for the divided identity experienced by blacks in the United States. The way that we are perceived in the physical world, our embodied identity, has historically been used as a basis for discrimination. This issue becomes particularly interesting today as we examine online communication, where our physical traits often remain hidden from those with whom we interact. Race, ethnicity, and life chances. Race and ethnicity influence all aspects of our lives, including health, education, work, family, and interactions with the criminal justice system and healthcare. In U.S. education, the highest high school dropout rates are associated with those from economically disadvantaged and non-English speaking backgrounds. Maybe it is true that high school is harder for these individuals, or that they are more likely to have to leave school due to family responsibility, but think about this from a structural perspective. Isn't there any way that the structure of the education system could be modified to encourage these individuals to complete their educations rather than dropping out? Could this be an example of institutional discrimination, where the structure of education systematically denies opportunity to those from economically disadvantaged and non-English speaking backgrounds? Race, ethnicity, and life chances. Inequality can also be seen in the workplace and in income distribution. People of color who are less likely to achieve high levels of education are more likely to have low-paying jobs. Inequality in education leads to further inequalities in life. For instance, it is harder to get a high-paying job without a higher level of education. Additionally, without a good job, it is harder to gain access to insurance and health care. In 2013, the median U.S. income for Asian Americans was $67,065. For whites, it was $58,270. For Hispanics, it was $40,963. And for African Americans, it was $34,598. In 2013, 9.6% of whites had lived below the poverty line, compared with 27.2% of African Americans and 23.5% of Hispanics. Race, ethnicity, and life chances. Also, non-whites are more likely to interact with law enforcement. African Americans and Hispanics are much more likely to go to prison than whites. African Americans are also far more likely to be murdered than whites. Also, more than two-thirds of racially motivated hate crimes in 2013 targeted blacks. Is this because non-whites are more violent and commit more crimes, or is it because, for instance, the police are more likely to patrol inner-city areas than gated communities? You may ask students if they've heard the phenomenon called driving while black. Students may be able to articulate, just from reading the paper or watching the news, that it is more likely for a black person to be pulled over or arrested than for people of other races. If this phenomenon is accurate, what does that mean for black individuals who interact with the system? Race relations, conflict, or cooperation. Genocide is the deliberate and systematic extermination of a racial, ethnic, national, or cultural group. Population transfer is the forcible removal of a group of people from the territory they have occupied. Interactions between dominant and subordinate groups can take many different forms. Can you think of an example of genocide? What about population transfer? Race relations, conflict, or cooperation. Internal colonialism is the economic and political domination and subjugation of the minority group by the controlling group within a nation. Segregation is the formal and legal separation of groups by race or ethnicity. Internal colonialism could be thought of in terms of slavery or indentured servitude. As an example of segregation, in the U.S. South up to the 1960s, not only did blacks live in separate neighborhoods, they were restricted to colored-only sections of buses, parks, restaurants, and even drinking fountains. Race relations, conflict, or cooperation. Assimilation, the minority group is absorbed into the mainstream or dominant group, making society more homogeneous. Racial assimilation, racial minority groups are absorbed into the dominant group through intermarriage. Cultural assimilation, racial or ethnic groups are absorbed into the dominant group by adopting the dominant group's culture. Assimilation is the central idea behind America's melting pot. Minority group members may lose their previous ethnic or racial identity. Race relations, conflict, or cooperation. Pluralism or multiculturalism is a pattern of intergroup relations that encourages racial and ethnic variation within a society. Pluralism not only permits racial and ethnic variation within one society, it actually encourages people to embrace diversity, to exchange the traditional melting pot image for a salad bowl. At the core of multiculturalism is tolerance of racial and ethnic differences.